This episode is brought to you by the Fertility Awareness Mastery Charting Workbook, the first beautifully designed, fully customizable paper charting workbook designed with you in mind. With 3 years worth of charting pages, the Fertility Awareness Mastery Charting Workbook has you covered. If you've been looking for a solid alternative to charting apps, you'll love this charting workbook. The FAM Charting Workbook is available in both Fahrenheit and Celsius editions and is available in spiral-bound, paperback, and ebook versions. Head over to fertilityfriday.com/workbook to order your copy today. That's fertilityfriday.com/workbook. This is the Fertility Friday podcast, episode number 468. Welcome to the Fertility Friday podcast, your source for information about the fertility awareness method and all things fertility. I'm your host, Lisa Hendrickson-Jack. I'm the author of The Fifth Vital Sign and the Fertility Awareness Mastery Charting Workbook. I'm a certified fertility awareness educator and holistic reproductive health practitioner with over 20 years of experience teaching women to connect to their fifth vital sign through menstrual cycle charting, balancing hormone health, and optimizing the menstrual cycle without hormones. I have been consistently outspoken about hormonal birth control over the past 2 decades and its impact on fertility and overall health because you have the right to know how your body works and how artificial hormones disrupt that natural process. I teach women's health professionals how to utilize the menstrual cycle as a vital sign in their practices, and I host live coaching programs to help you achieve optimal fertility and health because it's important to have healthy menstrual cycles regardless of whether or not you want to have babies. I'm also a wife and mother of 2 beautiful boys and a brand new baby girl. This podcast is designed to empower you to take full control of your cycles, your fertility, and your overall health. And I'm so excited that you're here with me today. Today, I'm sharing my interview with Joe Whittaker. And in today's episode, we are diving into sperm quality. And it's a really interesting conversation. We get into the issue that many of you have heard of with the declining sperm counts. We get into what it is, how bad it is, and why it's happening. And in this episode, I feel like we shed some light on some of the factors that you may have thought of, but other factors that you may not have considered. So a really interesting episode. Of course, I focus on sperm quality a lot around here because after all, men are responsible for about 50% of infertility. And that's something that we don't necessarily think about. I mean, unless you've been listening to the podcast and you've heard that stat before. Generally speaking, people wouldn't think that male factor infertility would be a factor, either the whole sole factor or a contributing factor 50% of the time for couples who are struggling to conceive, but that's actually the case. So certainly I love highlighting sperm health at any opportunity I can because it's so important in the equation of successful conception. So before we start, I'll share a little bit about Joe. Joe Whittaker is a nutritionist, personal trainer, and researcher. His scientific work is focused on the effect of diet on men's fertility and testosterone levels. His work has been published in top academic journals and widely featured in the media. He holds an MSc in nutritional therapy from the University of Rochester and is currently working towards his PhD. He also runs a private clinic helping clients optimize their health and well-being using diet and lifestyle strategies. So without further ado, let's go ahead and tune into today's episode with Joe Whittaker. And I'm really excited to be here once again with Joe Whittaker. We had a really interesting, fascinating conversation a couple of years ago on male fertility, and I'm thrilled to have you back. I know you've been in the weeds with research, publishing a variety of papers, and I'll make sure to link your recent research to today's podcast page. But welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me on. You're obviously not sick of me yet.
No, I'm not, actually. I think your research is fascinating, and I always like the opportunity to talk about male fertility. You know, in the work that I do, I'm looking at the menstrual cycle and I'm working with women primarily. And what I've found to be fascinating over the many years that I've been doing this work is that I've seen these women's cycles. They're trying to conceive, and we can see when they're fertile. You can see if they're timing sex correctly. And it's something else to see women have sex at the right time, cycle over, cycle over, cycle over, and to have nothing happen. And so this is one of the reasons why I'm so passionate about talking about male fertility, because we need to be discussing it. So so you recently released a paper, and that is where I'm zoning in first, addressing or at least examining the question of this male fertility decline. So maybe share with us a little bit about that. I think the listeners have a bit of background there, but talk to us a little bit about what the research has said in terms of male fertility decline, like what's going on, how much. Well, I think people probably aren't even, I don't think people take this seriously enough, to be honest with you.
Yeah. I mean, in the paper is a kind of, it's a beast, really. I mean, it might deter anyone from actually reading the thing, but I can give you a synopsis at least. So, yeah, I mean, I'm sure your listeners are probably aware of this. There's several meta-analysis. Meta-analysis is just a combination of different studies. So it's like a higher quality of evidence. There's several of these now that showing a decline in sperm concentrations. They basically just take the individual data points across time and then see if there's a trend. And they all find this downwards trend. And it starts in about earlier stages like the 1930s. And then obviously it continues to present day. But the decline itself is pretty shocking. It's about that they roughly halve from like kind of pre-World War II to present day. Well, the units, it's about 100 million milliliter sperm concentration. That was say kind of like the original pre-World War II. And now it's like below 50. And if you want some kind of reference for that, below 15 is classed as like kind of clinical subfertility. But actually, if you look at the data, fertility starts to decline below 50 million milliliters. So it's basically saying that like half of men now have impaired fertility compared to their counterparts, earlier in the century. And then this kind of sperm data, it's not isolated. There are now, it's more limited, but there are several studies showing a decline in testosterone levels. They start in like the 70s, but who knows, maybe it was going on longer than that. And I know there are some researchers working on some bigger data sets in terms of that to kind of really thoroughly examine it. And then, so you can see there's sperm decline, testosterone seems to also be declining. It seems there's also been like an increase in kind of male reproductive pathologies. So ones with very long and difficult to pronounce names. But like things like testicular cancer and cryptochidism, which is kind of like a birth defect. And some limited data on like gynecomastia, which is like essentially man boobs, in the common terminology. So those are also increasing. So the kind of overall picture is that men's fertility, men's reproductive system, the health of that has greatly suffered over the 20th century. And it doesn't appear to be stopping. It just kind of appears to be continuing onwards.
Well, and the birth defect that you mentioned, that's the word is for undescended testes. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Just to give a kind of a concrete example, like some of the basic things that when I'm working with clients and we talk about how male fertility works, the testes are on the outside for a reason. It's not just a fun feature because the testes need to be a couple degrees cooler than the body in order to have optimal sperm production. So it's a serious problem that can lead to serious issues if the testes aren't functioning properly. So even just the increase in birth defects and it's very interesting. I think the natural question, of course, is why, right? Like that question can take us the whole rest of our interview. Yeah, share with us some of the findings, some of the why is this happening? Why is there such a significant decline in male fertility? It is very significant to think that the average man back in the 40s had sperm concentration of 100 million sperm per milliliter or more. And in today's day and age, the average man has less than 50 million. And the research is what it is. And that stat, I wrote that stat in the fifth vital sign coming from those. When you're looking at data, data is data, right? So if you and I are both looking at the data, we're going to come to the same conclusion, hopefully. Come to the same information. So why is that happening? I mean, for anyone, like, sorry, I feel like going on this tangent for just a second here. I feel like the gravity of the situation can't be understated, because if we continue on this trend, like, what happens in 50 years? What happens in 100 years? If it continues on this downward trend, what's the average man's sperm concentration going to be in 100 years? Like, is it going to be zero? Because, like, that's where we're trending.
Yeah, I mean, it might be zero. I mean, who knows? Yeah, that's where it's trending. I mean, it's difficult to say with any certainty what will happen. Yeah, there used to be some initial skepticism with this, but like the kind of studies are piled on top of one another. So there's increasingly less, and it's increasingly hard to make a counter argument. I could talk about the causes. Well, what I think is because I mean, I think why would it just be men? I mean, there's some suggestion of, maybe they're more susceptible, like sperm are very fragile and the testes are kind of like a fragile system in themselves. But I do think there may be a decline in female reproductive health. But it's a lot more difficult to study because like sperm and testosterone, that's easy to measure. The obvious, so you have to kind of look at it through like different angles. So women on average, like pre-industrial age, so like back in, I don't know, like, well, it varies for different countries, but back in like the 18th century or something, for Europe, women on average would have five children. And now on average they have two in kind of modern industrialized countries. And of course, a lot of that is behavioral, people make different choices. They use artificial contraception to achieve the number of children that they were not. Well, that's the previous explanations were heavily focused on kind of socio-economical factors. So, like for instance, you'd say, women are having less children now, or couples are having less children now because fewer die in childbirth, or like the cost per child has gone up. So it's like a rational choice. But some researchers are now kind of thinking maybe like there was a decline in the ability to reproduce as well, because we got that data from the men, but then maybe also there's something with the women as well. What was probably the most interesting thing when I was doing this research was that I started looking at twinning rates, because they're a really good marker of fertility. So they do like it's like twins per 1,000 live births. So it's kind of standardized like that. And in the literature, they noticed that from like the early 20th century to the 1980s, that this like decline in twinning rates. And it's not really explained why that's happening. So, it might suggest, well, it might be something to do with the sperm, like, only one's getting up there, not two. But it also might be, a combination of the females as well. But then after 1980, they go up. And it's because of, I'm sure you know this, medically assisted reproduction takes off. So you get IVF, but also all the other techniques, which now, interestingly, like those techniques, medically assisted reproduction, so IVF and like intrauterine insemination, they account for about 3.8% of European births now. So that also makes you think, well, I'd be interested to hear your kind of clinical perspective on this. Like, if you think more and more couples struggling to conceive, if you think there's a temporal increase, you're seeing more and more people.
I think that, the rate of infertility, they say, is 1 in 6 couples, about 15%. I think that there is, so my personal thoughts on that are that I do think there is an increase. As to why, is it because of an inherent drop in fertility? I think it's more complicated than that. I think that social trends have changed, and I've had this conversation with many clients and on certain interviews and things like that. But the current climate in our culture is not one that is favorable to young women who want to start families early. We all know this. So, unfortunately, biologically speaking, the best time biologically, don't yell at me. I'm just saying, for a woman to have a baby is when she's like literally early 20s or late teens. Like that's when we are biologically, like the egg quality is the highest, right? Like all of the things are kind of working in our favor. And it doesn't even mean that there aren't women in that age group who have challenges conceiving, because there are. But biologically speaking, that is the kind of prime time. Ironically, that is also the time that we are like heavily not trying to have baby culturally from a societal perspective. And if you think about it, our culture doesn't support it. It doesn't, when you think about what is life like for a 19-year-old woman, right? Who's like, what is life like for her? She hasn't started her career. She probably doesn't have a lot of money, not a lot of stability, right? We're not really even encouraged to get married that young. So it's really, really hard. So what happens, I think you can see where I'm going with this, is that then our culture says, well, you have to have it all together. You have to have a stable relationship. You need to have your career. You need to have a home. You need to have all of these things. And so by the time we're getting to this place where it's all perfect, all the T's are crossed, I's are dotted, we are in our 30s. We're fully midway in our 30s too, a lot of women now. And so is it that there's an inherent decline in fertility? Maybe, but also that we have to consider, if you're not even trying to start a family until you're in your 30s, then the chances of you conceiving easily and having however many kids you want, like if you wanted to have 4 kids, but you start when you're 35, the chances of that happening are less than if you had started when you were 25, right? So that's my take on it. There's obviously a lot more that could be said about that, but that's a starting point to what I see is happening,
Yeah. No, that's a fair point. I think that probably accounts for the lion's share, definitely. But there was this group of researchers, and they pitted against like women in 1900 versus today, and like they pitted them per age group of when they have children, and even then they did see like, so if you started a family at like 35 in 1900 versus today, they still saw a decrease. But it was obviously, it was 5-2, not that figure. It would be like, I don't know, 3-2 or something, or 3-2.5. Like, so maybe like the biological bit accounts for like, if the fertility transition, as they call it, is 5-2, maybe the biological bit accounts for like 1 or 1.5 of that. And then the majority is behavioral and cultural.
Yeah. I feel like that, like I resonate with that. I feel like I would be hesitant to say that it's all biological, the reason that people are having more difficulty conceiving, but there is definitely a component. So we have kind of a perfect storm of challenges for people. So it seems like it potentially could be harder for people because of these issues. Obviously, with the sperm decline, I will beat that dead horse for the rest of my career because people really need to get on top of this and understand how important male fertility is to the equation, because it does account for 50% of the issues with when couples are struggling with infertility, whether it's solely male factor or a combination of male and female factor, it's still 50%. And so from that perspective, we've got 2 challenges. One of the challenges is that we're not, the prime time to reproduce culturally is not prime time biologically. So we already have this situation where we're both older, and we do know that there's some level of age-related decline that plays into fertility. But then we also have whatever it is that's going on that's causing male fertility to drop by 50%. So we also have this biological factor. And then, like you said, there has to be, like, it's not like it's only men out here. Like, obviously this decline has to be happening to both of us, but we just don't have the same ability to measure it simply. So I'm there with you. And I think that we are seeing the issues with it. I wouldn't have a career, right, if everything was just fine, right? If everyone could just easily conceive when they needed to, I wouldn't need to be doing this podcast.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. I mean, it's a thorny issue in terms of this, but you're well versed in it. You asked me about the causes. I mean, I can go into those if you want. Well, at least
Yeah.
what I think, not just what I think. Of course, it's backed up by some evidence and other people. Well, if I stick to I know the male side best, but a lot of this may apply to women as well. An obvious thing is that rates of like metabolic diseases, so things like obesity, diabetes, metabolic syndrome, they have just like skyrocketed at the same time as this decline has taken off. And there's known links, they're more than known. They're becoming, as one would say, well established. That obesity and diabetes decrease. They're well known to decrease testosterone levels. They also probably decrease sperm counts. And there are some recent RCTs on it showing, like, when obese men lose weight, they have a large like increase in their sperm concentrations. So that's one obvious thing. And it's not like a light problem. In terms of obesity, like the current worldwide obesity rate is about 12%. But if you just take quote unquote Western countries, so like Europe, North America, Australia, New Zealand, it's like 30%. Although that figure is 2016. So I was doing this earlier, so I was thinking, what happens if you extend the line to 2023 and it's like 35%? So it's roughly like, over a third of people in Europe and North America are obese. And then the figures for the other like metabolic diseases, like metabolic syndromes, estimated about 30% of the worldwide population has metabolic syndrome. It's difficult to describe. It's almost like a hybrid between obesity and diabetes. It's kind of like a classic sign is like kind of fat around the middle, but not elsewhere, like skinny fat, like the dad bod almost. That's kind of the metabolic syndrome. So that's one obvious thing. And then what's underpinning that is not that hard to figure out. It's the change in diet in combination with decreased physical activity.
And can I ask a question about obesity? Because I feel like as a person in the world, when I hear the word obesity, I picture someone who is on TV, right? Like who's like 600 pounds, right? Like you kind of picture that. So, but then the medical definition of obesity is a little bit different. Like, are you able to define that a little bit for us? Like, so we have a sense of like, who are we really talking? 30%, we know that 30% of people are not like 600 pounds, right? So how are they defining obesity?
So it's a BMI of over 30, but so I don't know, what's that for the average man? It's like, I don't know. I could have worked out before. Probably like 90 kilograms for the average man or something like that.
Okay. Yeah. So like almost 200 pounds, like, so depending on the height, weight and all that, or the height. And but I guess I think you could see the point that I'm making, where there's a medical definition of obesity that is not the same as a social definition of obesity. And so when we're looking at those rates, it's like a different body composition than what you might think.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of people who would meet that definition, but you would see them and you wouldn't think that they're obese. But that also, it's because we are living in a different time now, and we're used to seeing people that are a lot larger than they ever could. Like I believe that in the 1900s, there just were not people that were that large. So we, like, a person who is just considered a normal kind of heavier weight, heavier set today would have potentially been considered like obese back then.
Yeah. Well, almost like well over half in Western countries are overweight. So they're outside the normal range. I suppose like if above 30 BMI is clinically obese, probably what people imagine is obese is like 40, like the extreme kind of cases.
Yeah.
Yeah. And like, in 1900, there was like barely anyone, probably just a few rich people. But they're the only ones who can afford enough food to get obese. Yeah, it's obviously the change in diet. They use this term, it's called nutrition transition, which is like the transition from pre-industrial kind of agricultural, unrefined diet. So if you're thinking like, kind of like what would a farmer eat, kind of like that. And then it shifts to the semi-refined diet where you start getting increases in sugar, and vegetable oils, like refined ingredients that people can use. And then eventually it transitions to our diet now to like highly refined modern processed foods in kind of like the late industrial stage. And that's obesity does seem to rise like in the initial stages, but it's really it's that late stage where you get those, they call them in academics, ultra processed foods, which is not like it is, it's the things you're thinking about, like candy bars, chocolate, soft drinks, but it's also like the pre-packaged, like meals, like pizzas, just like very like ready to consume, easy to eat. And the reason they stimulate obesity is they're basically like hyper palatable. So they like your body has normal, it has a way of regulating its appetite, but that kind of gets deranged when you eat these like hyper palatable, very calorie dense foods. And so it can kind of, it enables you to overeat essentially. And obviously, if you overeat in the long term, you'll put on the weight. So that's why it's very key. It's almost like the common notion of obesity is like it's like the willpower theory. It's just a lack of willpower, but it doesn't really add up if you think these rates are skyrocketing. Everybody's not losing their willpower. It's almost like these foods, yeah, as I said, like they increase your appetite, they enable you to eat more. So if you're in, it's quite hard to eat those foods in moderation,
Well,
especially
and
over the
it's
long
not
term.
incidental. So I don't have a lot of like background in this field of like food science, but there's a field of these companies. It's not incidental. It's not like you just buy these candy bars and they just happen to taste the way they do and whatever. There are entire departments in these companies where they research flavors and spend millions of dollars to get the flavors just right to get you addicted to the foods. Like, I don't know if you know anything about that. We don't need to go into that rabbit hole, but just to kind of put it out there in to your comment of it's not just about willpower. I mean, I don't think that the average consumer really knows how like we don't really understand how much effort, money, education goes into that food that you buy, that thing that you pull out of that bag or whatever, that treat that you have. We don't really realize how much thought has gone into making it as addictive as possible so that we spend as much money as possible with these companies.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like David and Goliath. I mean, you've got these massive multinational corporations. Yeah, they're food scientists. I remember, yeah, I mean, there's loads like in terms of they'll balance exactly like the amount of fat, the amount of salt, the amount of sugar, the density of the foods to get the perfect like flavor combination, which is, it way surpasses anything you could recreate naturally. Although on the other hand, professional chefs actually use like high level professional chefs use very similar techniques, like especially in the desserts, to kind of almost create this kind of candy like and like intensity of flavor.
Well, and it's not just the flavor. Like I remember hearing something about like getting the crunchiness just right so that it makes the sound, so that it's sad. It's like it's this whole thing. So that's a big piece of it. I mean, that's a whole, maybe I should find a food scientist and interview. Like that would be really interesting. If you know any, that would be so interesting. So, I mean, we don't have to go totally down the weeds there, although it is really fascinating, but I think that it is useful to think about that for a moment, because I think especially for the listeners of this podcast, or if you've been consuming content about food, it's easy for us to be like, yeah, we know food. Yeah. But sometimes I think we got to take a pause and think about it. And it's not just food. Yeah. Like this is like a multi-trillion probably dollar business. And these companies are actively doing everything they can to make us want to eat more. And none of that is related to health and making us healthier. Like it's not part of the equation. Like it's like the food isn't even food anymore. It's like it's a product. So It's worth thinking about. And I think that it's really interesting to think about how that, like what you said about the chart and how it's going up. And to be honest with you, when I'm thinking about the sperm dropping, that's not the first thing that comes to mind, yet it is likely one of the absolute most, if not the most relevant factors in the gradual sperm decline.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, the chemicals is obviously a major cause. Well, not obviously, but purported to be a major cause. But with those ultra processed foods, if you think about the foods they displace, so they displace the more nutrient rich foods, fruits, vegetables, nuts, meat, fish, and they're replaced by these highly refined foods that most of the nutrients are stripped out of them. And there's quite a bit of evidence on in terms of like vitamins and minerals and sort of micronutrients, and then phytonutrients, which are the chemicals within plants, improving men's fertility, like the sperm concentrations, like when they give them supplements of these foods, supplements of these nutrients to isolate the effects. And it makes you think, like, because these processed foods are displacing the more nutrient rich foods, so you would think that the nutrient intake may be lower, although you have to balance that with people actually eat more. So it's kind of like a catch 22. But I mean, it's plausible that we had more nutrients in the past, and that supported male fertility, and now we have less, and it doesn't support it as much. There's some other interesting stuff in terms of like even the way the foods have grown. So over the last 100, 200 years, even before that, but especially in the last 100 to 200 years, they've increased, like farmers have increasingly selected, sorry, let's say the last 100 years, they've increasingly selected high yield crops. So crops that they grow on the same amount of land, but they grow bigger than their predecessors. And what is interesting actually, what happens, because when you grow more of the food, you get more calories, but you don't get more minerals. It's kind of like it dilutes them, like blowing up a balloon. Like there's still the same amount of balloon there. It's just taking up like a bigger space. So even trends like that, and then of course you've got the pesticides or agrochemicals. It's like the broader term, like pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, and they, like, it's some pretty well studied in mice. Like high doses of them will cause like outright male infertility. Of course, we don't get high doses; we just get very small doses, unless you're eating organic foods. And so it's more controversial whether that has an effect, as it's properly difficult to study. I mean, you can do it in mice, but like, how are you going to do it in humans? But there may be, some link in terms of we're now exposed to all these chemicals that we weren't before, and they're not doing our gonads any good.
Just popping into today's episode to invite you to join my Fertility Awareness Mastery online self-study program. If you're looking for an informative and comprehensive DIY option for learning fertility awareness, I've got you covered. This program is the most comprehensive fertility awareness self-study program available. And the best part is you can learn at your own pace in your living room for a fraction of the cost of one of my live coaching programs. Head over to fertilityfriday.com/mastery for details. That's fertilityfriday.com/mastery. Now let's go ahead and jump back into today's episode.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's so interesting to think about all the different reasons why the sperm is declining. And I'm glad that you focused on the metabolic issues and the obesity issue, and really talked a little bit about the food aspect on a broader scale, because that's the role that's playing, we can't even imagine. And when you talked about these ultra processed foods displacing nutrients, countering that with eating more, from the perspective that I come from, in terms of supporting men and women to conceive, for me, it's not about necessarily like eating more food in a general sense, but it's about adding in specific foods that tend to be more nutrient dense. And so for anyone who listens to the podcast, I'm the one talking about, liver and organ meats, and looking at some of those ancestral type foods that when you look at the micronutrient makeup, they're a lot higher, they're a lot denser. And then taking some inspiration from what people did before all of this industrialization. They ate all the bits. So back in the day, they would cut up the animal and eat all of it, and make broth with the bones and all of that. So it wasn't just selective eating of only muscle meats or whatever the case was. And so it is really interesting to think about that, and the way you described making it so that we can grow more food on the same piece of land, but having that food then come out not to have the same nutrient density. So just as an anecdote, when I was growing up, my dad had this big garden. He still has it. He has this I think it's big for the size just of a regular home, right? In small city or whatever. Like, I think it's a pretty big garden. And he always made more food than what we could handle. And he would always have to give away food. And so my husband and I have this whole thing where he likes to buy frozen peas, and I can't stand to eat frozen peas. And he's kind of like, oh, you don't like peas? And I'm like, no, those aren't peas. So we could laugh about this all day, but the peas that my dad grew in his garden they taste like, to me, that's what peas taste like. They taste so good. They're just delicious. I could eat them all day. And when I eat the peas, so sorry, whoever makes these peas and freezes them like for mass consumption, they don't taste like peas to me. And so I often wonder, for those individuals, a lot of people who just never really had that experience of having fresh food from the garden, like garden to plate kind of scenario, and you're eating this manufactured food, like you're saying, that's being grown on this giant, like this one piece of land now is pumping out all this extra food with the help of fertilizer, like petroleum-based fertilizer, and giving us food that doesn't taste as good. Honestly, it just doesn't. And the taste is related to the nutrient profile, I'm sure. How many people don't even know what food tastes like? I often wonder that. I don't know if you've thought about that too, but it relates to what you were describing.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I think it's typically the phytonutrient content of the plant chemicals that impart the flavors on the food, and they're known to be higher in organic foods. It doesn't necessarily have to have an organic label, but like vegetables you grow in your back garden are going to have a lot more phytonutrients than the kind of the mass grown ones. Yeah, they taste a lot better. It's funny, actually, you mentioned the liver thing, because I was talking to my sister-in-law the last time I was on, and I was like, oh yeah, I went on this podcast. It's called like Fertility Friday. And she was like, oh my God, I love that podcast. That's like my favorite one. And she told me she used to be a vegan, or she went for a bout of veganism whilst they were trying to conceive. And then she started listening to your podcast. And then like day after, she was like telling her husband, like, we need liver, get me liver. And like 2 weeks later, she got pregnant. But she got pregnant with twins.
Well, that's incredible. I feel like that's a hard one to be like, if you started 2 weeks ago, to say that it was directly related, but that is fascinating. And such a nice compliment. You'll have to tell her thank you.
All right, I'll tell her. When we're talking about the causes, there's like another strand that's it's kind of underappreciated, and the general term I want to use is epigenetics. So it's like genetics are heritable characteristics passed on through the genes, so those don't change. Whereas epigenetics are environmental influences from your parents that are passed on to you. So it's like the genes have you have the coded genes in each cell, and then around that there's the kind of epigenetic makeup. So it's almost like a little jacket. Depending on if that jacket gets torn or if it's well looked after, it's like passed on. In mice, they use mice a lot because it's really easy to study this kind of thing. Whereas in humans, it's much more difficult. They find that if you have obese parents, then you're vastly predisposed to obesity. It's worse if you've got 2 obese parents than 1. And then it's even if they give the mice a normal diet, children mice, they still overeat. And if they give them a quote unquote obesogenic diet, so like, the McDonald's diet or something, they overeat even more. And then if the mother mice, the maternal mice, if they're obese, the male offspring will have like poorer sperm, even on a normal diet. So I think part of this like decline in sperm is it's progressively each generation is kind of getting weaker and weaker. And so like even when the male baby's coming out of the womb, to some extent, they're already kind of like a step behind their fathers. And one of the most pressing studies, I'm sure you've read this study, it's called Pottinger's cats. So this guy in the 1940s called Francis Pottinger, he took loads of cats, so like hundreds of cats, and he bred them for successive generations. And he put some cats on the kind of optimal diet for cats, so like raw meat and raw milk, and then he put others on like increasingly refined diets. And he found the ones on the optimal diets, they bred successfully over the generations, and there wasn't any deterioration. But the ones on the worst diets, they increasingly got reproductive problems, and they also got all sorts of other problems like autoimmune diseases and allergies. But those cats on the worst diets, when he bred them, that he could only breed them 3 generations, and then they just could not breed anymore, which is kind of crazy. But like on a more positive note, he did find that if you gave the worst cats the optimal diet, that in 3 generations, so 3 generations back up, they were back to the health that they should be. I'll just say one last thing on that study, because a lot of people use it and say that it shows that humans should eat like a raw food diet, which it doesn't, because obviously humans and cats have different diets, but you can take the principle that it's showing cats on worse diets, because basically when you cook foods, the amino acid taurine gets broken down, and cats can't synthesize that, whereas we can. So, it doesn't quite equate. But you can take that principle of degeneration on a suboptimal diet. And actually, interestingly, if you've heard of Weston A. Price and his studies, where he showed the dental problems, the cats also got the same. They get like overlapping teeth and stuff, which is very interesting.
Yeah, I have his book, Nutrition and Physical Degeneration. So the cat study sounds very similar. I mean, if anything, it should give us pause. So what's interesting, as I'm sure you know from the research, we talked about this decline and how the average man, right, from the 40s versus the average man today. What would be interesting is to look at the data set and to look at the percentiles. So you have the average, but you'd have the percentile, like the 97.5, like the highest and the lowest, right? Because even today, like if the average is that, you still have men who have really high sperm. Like if you were to do like a random sample, you would still have men that have the really high amount. I'm getting to a point with with this, but I guess to put that out there to say that there is hope. And if you do things differently, you don't have to be the average. Like you can certainly do a lot of things to be beyond the average. But to take it back to the cat study, which I'm going to track down and read now, and the whole concept of Weston Price. So for anyone who's not familiar with that, he was a dentist and he traveled the world, and he wanted to figure out why it was that some of these groups of people, like these cultures, even though they were not touched by kind of modern civilization, why they had like perfect teeth. Because he was a dentist, so he was looking at bone structure, and he was trying to figure out like, why is it that these people who are basically living outside of modern society, they're living in low resource settings or whatever, living off the land, etc. Why is it that when he goes into these communities, these individuals have all their teeth, including their wisdom teeth, plenty of room in the jaw, no cavities at all, even though some of them didn't even brush their teeth, because we're talking about different cultures that were not touched by modern civilization. So why is that? And, he studied the foods, and he did a whole thing about the nutrient profile of the foods and everything. And basically, like the cats, discovered that when you had populations that were eating no ultra processed food or processed food, none of the sugary stuff that we eat all the time, and when they were eating predominantly off the land, and that was a combination of like the whole animal nose to tail, lots of raw dairy products, and like basically the stuff you would eat if you literally didn't live in a city and you actually had to kind of produce your own food, if that's the kind of stuff. And so it's all very interesting and terrifying to think that these animals in the cat study lost their ability to reproduce in 3 generations. Obviously, we're human and we're different, we eat a broader variety of food. We're not in a lab. But given that at the top of our call today, like given that we started from the place of saying that the fertility has dropped in half in terms of what men are putting out, obviously we're down the wrong road. Like we're the wrong cat group. We are eating the wrong stuff.
Yeah. Francis Pottinger, he died shortly after completing those studies, but him and Weston A. Price were going to do some research. There's the Price Pottinger Foundation, which promotes a lot of that research. They're really interesting. You can see the original papers, like the 40s.
Well, and if anyone is really like, if you've never heard of it before, or you didn't know, like the book Nutrition and Physical Degeneration, I'll link it, but it's a really interesting book because he did travel and he took pictures. And so he like shows you the difference of the teeth. I always say it's like kind of politically correct, right? But it's like, so if I were to describe it, I would say this was the time before everybody had, not everybody, but the majority of the population had access to modern dental work. So you see these pictures of people like, so I'm just going to put it out there. I often wonder, because we have all this amazing dental work. We have dentists and orthodontists, like we have all of this stuff. So when you're seeing people, everyone, well, most of the people, like at least like in Canada where I live, and like most people have, like by the time they're adults, like if they have issues with their teeth, often they're minimal. Well, I'll just put it that way, because I do know that everyone doesn't have access to dental care. But the point is that if we didn't have modern dental care, what would everyone's teeth look like?
I mean, it's a stereotype. It's a stereotype that British people have bad teeth, but they've been industrialized the longest out of everyone. So they've had, sugar. They were the first guys on the scene. Yeah, I wonder what it would be like. I mean, if we didn't have modern dental care, we'd have a lot poorer teeth. Interesting, one of the places he went, I think it's the first chapter in that book, is Stornoway, which is the Outer Hebrides, which is Scotland. That's actually where my mum is actually, she was actually born there. And I talked to her about the diet, and they have this like unrefined diet. Like one of the dishes was they'd like bake oats and like fish, and then like a fish's liver or something. And they would like bake all that up, and that was like a traditional dish. Yeah, she loved it when I told her, "Oh, Mum, your hometown is in this book."
That's awesome.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, it's so interesting to think. But I guess to bring it all home, right? This conversation has been really fascinating. We've gone in a lot of different directions. But based on your research and even, our conversation, where do we go from here? What is the solution? I think we've touched on a couple things, but for, women who are listening, who are concerned about their partner's sperm health, maybe trying to conceive hasn't been happening as quickly as they had hoped. I find that the stereotype from my experience is that the women, because we're the ones who have the cycles, we're the ones who carry the babies and have the visual evidence of fertility, we are often focused on what we can do to fix ourselves. So when I'm working with fertility clients, they are usually the ones coming to me with a supplement list that they're taking a mile long. They've given up everything that they used to like to eat. They're, you know what I mean? Like they're on board. They're doing everything. They're running the marathon themselves. And then they're like stereotypically, like tongue in cheek, their partner's like drinking beer on the couch. So not to throw the men under the bus. Obviously, every man isn't doing that. But just to go with the stereotypical example to drive the point home is that we're prepared as women to kind of do all the work. And it slips our mind. We don't really even think about his contribution. So where do we start?
No, it's not a stereotype. Men are a bit lazy. And where you start with the guys, number one is weight loss. So you got to get a healthy weight, and I mean there's loads of ways you can do it. So I won't go into detail, but that's number one. Get into a healthy weight. That will boost your testosterone, and it will increase your sperm counts, particularly if you're very overweight. Then you can focus on, outside of that, you can focus on like the nutrient-rich foods. Particular ones you want to pay attention to is omega-3 fatty acids found in oily fish. You could take them as a supplement. Then the most important minerals are selenium, zinc, magnesium. Selenium, like Brazil nuts. If few Brazil nuts a day, zinc, things like red meat. Magnesium, most people are deficient in it, so I would buy a supplement for that. Do like 200 milligrams a day, so like half the RDA, and then you'll get the other half in your food. Specific for vitamins, B9, B12, C, and E. So the foods for vitamin C are like fruits and vegetables, particularly fruits. E is like things like avocados, nuts, like the quote unquote healthy fats. And the B vitamins you should get in your diet. But then, so I would suggest most of those nutrients get in your diet. You can look at the different foods. You can take what's called nutraceuticals, or like just like supplements in everyday parlance. The best ones for men's testosterone, for men's fertility, CoQ10 and carnitine. Interestingly, carnitine, the only real dietary source is beef. So you can have like loads of steaks, and I'm sure it will do you good. And then in terms of the diet, was phytonutrients. So again, you can take supplements, like the top ones being like lycopene, curcumin, resveratrol, but you're probably best just trying to get as many of those, like a broad spectrum of those in your diet. So lots of fruits and vegetables, like colored plant food. That would be like one of the last supplements on your list, if nothing else was working or something. And then there's a few studies on walnuts boosting sperm motility. So walnuts. And then, so that's the diet. The other kind of just general housekeeping, exercise, like decent sleep. You don't have to quit alcohol, but limit it. No smoking and no drugs. And then last thing your listeners will be very familiar with is try to reduce your exposure to the endocrine disrupting chemicals. So basically nasty chemicals. And where you'll find those most in terms of diet is plastics. So avoid foods that are, especially liquids that are contained in plastics. Never like heat food in plastic. So try if you can store it in glass, and buy foods that are not. It's okay if it's just like loosely in a plastic bag, like rice or something, but it's the ones that are like in contact. And then I'd say, you could do organic foods to avoid the pesticides. I know that's more expensive, so some people might not. And then I keep saying this is going to be the last thing. I said there's two last things because it's turning into a long list. So trans fats, they're mostly phased out now, but avoid them. And they're normally like, you'll find them in like processed kind of baked goods. And then like mercury is not good. It's not good for anyone. And it's also not good for men. And where you find that is in large fish. So if you want to get your omega-3s from fish, get them from fish. Just choose the smaller fish like salmon, mackerel, anchovies, herring or kippers, and avoid the large fish like tuna, swordfish. I think in the US you have something called king mackerel or something. So that's like, avoid the large ones because they accumulate this mercury, and focus on the small ones. Yeah, so that's a kind of whistle stop tour.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the good news about male fertility, I think, is that there is often a lot of things you can do to see tangible improvements. It's a little bit different. For example, for women working on egg quality, obviously you can track the menstrual cycle and see improvements there for someone who is into that. But it's a little bit less, like you can't pull out your ovary and like just pull out a bunch of eggs. Like it's just not a thing. So I think the one of the positive things with tracking male fertility is that there is hope. And if the results are very, very bad, very poor, then it is important also to follow up with a medical professional to make sure that there's no functional problems with the sperm production. So it's a big topic, but I feel like you covered a lot with the list. And hopefully what the listeners are taking away with from this conversation is just that it's the way I often describe it to my clients is that when we talk about it in this macro kind of level, it's not just to say, oh, your partner did something wrong. that's why his sperm is low. Like if you do a sperm test and the sperm isn't ideal, it's not just something your partner did. This is a worldwide problem. And like I said, I think it should be on the front page of every newspaper. Like we should be really concerned about this trend. I don't know why we're not more concerned about it, to be honest with you. Maybe we're distracted by all the things that are happening in the world. Like every day there's a new thing. But this is a big one, because if we continue trending down this path, then at some point we're going to have a really big problem, like a much bigger problem, where it's going to be a lot harder for couples to conceive. So hopefully through the work that you continue to do and the research and, you know, everyone else who's working in this field will get some more attention to this topic.
Yeah. I think on an individual basis, there's loads you can do to fix it. Even if you've got terrible sperm quality, I mean, where there's a will, there's a way. I mean, there's loads of resources out there. So you'll be able to get adequate. On a societal level, I mean, I don't know. You know, maybe people just want to eat McDonald's. I mean, maybe what, like, in terms of like the regulators and politicians, they should focus on the most expensive things. But it's much more on an individual basis. You can fix it. But yeah, it's much harder on a societal scale.
Yeah, that's a whole other thing. Well, this has been such a great conversation. Where can the listeners go to find out more about you? I'm going to make sure to link to the research papers that you've been working on, and I'll link to the previous episode we did together, because if you really enjoyed today's conversation, you'll definitely want to go back and listen to our first episode together. But tell us what you've been working on and where we can go to find more information about you.
Yeah, well, there's obviously the papers, as you said. Best place, just go to my website, joewhittakernutrition.com. You can find any information there. I'm not really on social media. It's too crazy for me. So yeah, go to the website.
And when would you have time to do all of this research, honestly? If you were spending all your time on social media. I appreciate that. Well, thank you so much for being here. This has been such a treat.
All right, cool. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed today's show, please share it with a friend. You'll find the show notes page for today's episode over at fertilityfriday.com/468. I hope that you enjoyed today's episode all about sperm quality. I find it just to be such an important topic. I'm sure you could tell by my responses. I just don't understand why everybody isn't talking about this and why it's not on billboards. You know, it's a pretty big deal that if we continue in this downward spiral trend in terms of sperm quality, then within a generation or two, the average man isn't really going to have a whole lot of sperm to speak of, and it's going to be exceedingly difficult for people to conceive naturally. And it's certainly time to look at those numbers and start to question why, and turn this cycle of declining fertility around. And interestingly, I think that at least with men with sperm counts, we can quantify what's going on, but with women, we don't do a corresponding egg count. So what is the corresponding loss of fertility happening on the female side that we just can't easily measure? So I'll leave you with that interesting thought. I think fortunately, we have the ability to support our fertility, improve our hormones in a variety of different ways. And so I think that's the hope here. The first thing to do is to identify the problem. And then of course, the second thing to do is to figure out what we can do to resolve it and improve the situation. So with that said, I hope you have a wonderful weekend whenever you're tuning into the show. And of course, as always, until next time, be well and happy charting.